It was one of those nights where the snow seemed endless, blanketing everything. My shift at the clinic had run late, and the drive home was already daunting. The roads were slick, and the snowfall created a haze under the glow of my headlights. But I didn't mind. I love my job as a veterinary technician, and the peace of driving alone after a long day was something I usually cherished. This night felt different, though. There was an odd heaviness in the air, a stillness that didn't feel comforting. I thought it was just exhaustion. About halfway home, I noticed the snowbanks on either side of the road growing taller, narrowing my path. The roadside trees stood tall and still, their dark forms blended seamlessly into the surrounding darkness. I hadn't seen another car in miles, which wasn't unusual for these rural roads, but it still left me feeling strangely vulnerable. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. The faint sound of a baby crying drifted through the cold. I lowered the volume of my radio, trying to listen. The crying came again, low but clear, carried by the wind. I slowed my car, looking at the dark forest on my right. The sound was coming from there. It didn't make sense. Why would a baby be out here in the middle of nowhere during a snowstorm? I pulled over, hesitating as the cries grew clearer. My breath fogged the windshield as I sat there. Everything in me screamed to stay in the car and keep driving. But another part, maybe the vet tech in me, or just the human, couldn't ignore it. If a baby was really out there, they wouldn't survive long in these conditions. Grabbing my phone to use as a flashlight, I stepped out of the car. The cold hit me like a slap, the kind that seeps through every layer of clothing and chills you to the bone. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I made my way toward the tree line, the flashlight beam shining through the dense snowfall. "Hello?" I called. "Is anyone out there? Do you need help?" The crying continued in the distance. It was coming from deeper in the woods. I stopped, looking back at my car. The safety of its warm interior felt miles away, but I couldn't leave now. As I pushed further into the forest, the trees felt like they were closing in tighter. The crying grew louder, more urgent. I scanned the ground and my surroundings, expecting to find a stroller or someone in distress. Instead, I found a small patch of disturbed snow. At its center was a baby blanket, partially buried under the fresh powder. I bent down to pick it up, my fingers trembling as I brushed the snow away. The blanket was damp and frayed at the edges, the kind of thing that had seen years of use. My stomach churned. Where was the baby? That's when I heard the sound of branches snapping behind me. My flashlight whipped around, illuminating nothing but trees and snow. "Hello?" I called again, this time louder. The crying had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. A sudden gust of wind rustled the branches, and for a moment I thought I saw movement, something darting between the trees. My heart thudded in my chest as I backed away, clutching the blanket like it was some kind of shield. I turned toward the direction of my car, but it was hard to tell where I'd come from. The snow was falling heavier now, obscuring my footprints. I cursed to myself, my breath coming out in visible puffs. Another snap of a branch, closer. Is someone there? My voice was firmer now, masking the growing panic I felt. The beam of my flashlight danced over the trees, but there was no one. Just shadows and snow. Then I heard it again. The crying. But this time, it wasn't distant. It was behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam shaking as I tried to locate the source. Suddenly, the crying stopped, leaving an almost deafening silence in its wake. My body locked up even though my mind was screaming to run. But then, I saw them, footprints in the snow, leading away from where I stood. I followed their path with the flashlight. The prints seemed to weave through the trees. "Enough," I muttered to myself. Whatever this was, it wasn't normal. I started walking back in the direction I hoped my car was, my flashlight sweeping side to side. The snow made it harder to see, and every noise, the wind, the crunch of snow underfoot, felt magnified. Then I saw it. Through the falling snow, my car came into view. For a brief moment, I felt relief, but it was gone just as fast. A shadow moved across the road, just at the edge of my headlights. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I bolted for the car, gripping the blanket tightly as if it would somehow protect me. Once inside, I locked the doors and fumbled with the ignition. As soon as the engine started, I wasted no time pulling back onto the road. By the time I got home, I was shaking. I tossed the blanket onto the kitchen counter and collapsed onto the couch, trying to make sense of it all. Had it been a prank? Some twisted joke? Or was there something more to it? The next morning, I couldn't let it go. That blanket, the sound of the cries, they haunted me. I decided to call the local sheriff's office. When I explained what had happened, the deputy on the other end of the line fell silent for a moment before asking me to come in. At the station, they listened carefully as I recounted everything. When I mentioned the baby blanket, one of the deputies looked at the other. Finally, he spoke. "That stretch of road has a history," he said. "We've had reports of strange sounds and sightings out there for years. Sometimes it's laughter, sometimes crying. A few people have even claimed to see figures in the trees. We've investigated, but we've never found anything concrete. And honestly, most folks prefer not to talk about it." I felt a chill run through me. "What about the blanket?" I asked. "Doesn't that mean someone was out there?" "We've found blankets before," he admitted. "But no babies. No people either. It's like whoever or whatever left them disappears without a trace." His words stayed with me as I drove home, the afternoon sun doing little to ease the tension in my chest. That stretch of road, those woods, they weren't normal. I knew that now. A week later, I had to take the same route home after a late shift. The tension in my hands was obvious as I gripped the wheel while passing the spot where I'd pulled over. I looked over the tree line, part of me certain that something or someone was hidden there. The woods were silent, but as I drove on, I couldn't rid myself of the thought that I wasn't alone. I don't know what I heard that night, or who, or what was out there, but I haven't driven that stretch of road since. And every time I hear a baby crying, I can't help but feel a shiver of unease. Driving delivery routes in Alaska wasn't for the faint of heart, especially in winter, and even more if you are a female driver like me. The roads were unforgiving, the cold could sap the life out of you, and the isolation, well, you had to be okay with your own company. That night in 2018, I was on the tail end of a grueling shift, the kind where your eyes sting from staring at endless snow-covered roads. My truck was loaded with packages for remote addresses, the kind of places where people valued the rare delivery service. The storm had started to pick up just as the last light of day slipped away. The snow came down heavy, coating the road and obliterating the faint tire tracks that had been my only guide. I'd driven this route enough times to know it was miles before the next town and even farther to the last stop on my list. The heater in the truck was barely holding up, and I had a thermos of lukewarm coffee to keep me company. About 20 miles from nowhere, my truck's tires skidded on an icy patch. I corrected, but the back wheels sank into the growing drifts on the roadside. No amount of rocking or cursing was going to get me unstuck. I was alone, surrounded by miles of empty snowfields and dense trees. I checked my phone. No signal. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the bitter cold to assess the situation. The wind was a knife slicing through my layers. Shining the light on the wheels, it wasn't good. The tires were buried halfway up, and there was no traction to be found. As I weighed my options, I spotted something in the distance. Headlights. I was overwhelmed with relief. Maybe it was another driver or a local who could help. The lights grew brighter as the vehicle approached, revealing the familiar shape of a snowplow. The plow stopped just behind my truck, its amber lights flashing against the falling snow. A man climbed out, bundled up in heavy winter gear, a scarf and hat. He waved and trudged toward me. "Looks like you're stuck," he called over the wind, his voice muffled by the scarf. "Yeah, can't get the tires to catch." "I can help dig you out," he offered, his breath visible in the freezing air. "But you'll freeze out here. Why don't you sit in my cab while I work?" Something about his suggestion didn't sit right. His tone was too casual, too eager. I shook my head. "I'll be fine out here. Got a flashlight and plenty of layers." The man's gloved hands rested on his hips. "Suit yourself, but it's warmer in the cab." "Thanks, but I'll stay with the truck," I said firmly. He stared at me for a moment longer before nodding. "All right, let me grab a shovel." He returned to his plow and rummaged in the back, but unease crept over me. It just didn't feel right. His movements were too slow, almost like he was buying time. I looked at my truck and considered locking myself inside, but before I could act, he returned with a shovel. "Let's see what we can do," he said. I kept my flashlight trained on the tires as he started digging. He worked slowly, his eyes flicking toward me more often than seemed normal. The hair on the back of my neck prickled, and I stepped back, increasing the distance between us. "You know," he said casually, pausing the shovel, "this road doesn't see much traffic at night. You're lucky I came along." "Yeah, lucky," I replied. The digging continued for another minute before he stopped and straightened up. "You're gonna need more than a shovel to get out of this. Why don't you hop in my cab and we'll call for a tow from town?" "I'd rather stay here," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral but firm. He dropped the shovel to the ground. "Suit yourself," he muttered. But as I turned back toward my truck, I felt a strong, sudden grip on my arm. My breath hitched as he yanked me backward. "You're being stubborn," he said, his voice low and threatening now. "Let me help you." "No," I shouted, twisting with every ounce of strength I had. "Let me go." I pulled away, adrenaline giving me strength as I planted my feet and jerked hard, breaking free from his grasp. I stumbled back toward my truck, fumbling for the door handle, but he was right behind me. "You're making this harder than it has to be," he growled, reaching for me again. I spun around, grabbing the shovel he'd dropped, and swung it wildly, not caring if it hit him or just scared him off. The blade sliced through the air, missing him by inches, but it was enough to make him step back. He glared at me, his friendly mask fully gone now, replaced with something cold and calculating. "Fine," he spat. "Good luck out here." He stomped back to his plow and climbed into the cab. I watched as he backed up, the rumble of the engine drowning out the wind. For a moment, I thought he was leaving, but instead of driving away, he maneuvered the plow to block my truck. "What are you doing?" I shouted, adrenaline spiking. The deafening sound of the plow's engine combined with the spinning amber lights sent panic coursing through me. I reached for the driver's door, yanked it open, and locked myself inside. The plow didn't move, but the man climbed out again, this time without the shovel. He walked toward my truck, his posture no longer friendly. He tapped on the window, his gloved hand leaving streaks on the glass. "Open up," he said, his voice muffled but clear. "You're not going anywhere without my help." I didn't respond. My hands trembled as I grabbed my phone, hoping for a signal. Still nothing. The man knocked again, harder this time. "I'm trying to help you," he said. I grabbed the flashlight from the passenger seat and shone it directly at his face. He flinched and stepped back, muttering something I couldn't hear. Then he turned and walked back to the plow. For a moment, I thought he was giving up. But then he inched the plow forward, the blade scraping against the snow and pushing it closer to my truck. He wasn't just blocking me in, he was trapping me. I couldn't stay in the truck. The engine was running, but if he decided to break a window or force the door, I'd be a sitting duck. I grabbed my flashlight and a small multi-tool from the glove compartment, my breath shaky as I braced myself. I opened the passenger door as quietly as I could and slipped out, landing in the snow. The wind swallowed any sound I made as I crept toward the woods. The moment I reached the tree line, I broke into a run. The snow was deep, each step a struggle, but I pushed forward. I didn't dare look back. The sound of the plow's engine was a constant reminder that I wasn't safe yet. My flashlight's beam wavered with my unsteady hands. I stumbled over roots and buried rocks, the cold biting at my face and hands. Then I heard it, the crunch of footsteps behind me. He was following me. I killed the flashlight and crouched low, my heart pounding in my ears. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I pressed myself against a tree, trying to steady my breathing. The footsteps paused and I heard him call out, "You can't hide out here forever. You'll freeze before you make it anywhere." His voice sent a shiver down my spine. I stayed still, praying he wouldn't find me. Minutes felt like hours as I waited, listening to his movements. Then, mercifully, the footsteps grew fainter, and the sound of the plow's engine rumbled back to life. I didn't wait to see if he was really gone. I kept moving, using the faint glow of the moon to guide me. But every step through the thick drifts felt like it was sapping what little energy I had left. My breath puffed out in clouds, and my legs burned. But I pushed forward. That's when I remembered something, a delivery I'd made months ago. An old cabin tucked away in these woods. It had been small and weathered, but the owner, a quiet man in his 60s, had seemed kind enough. It wasn't close, but it was my only shot. I adjusted my course and started heading in the direction I thought the cabin might be, praying I could find it in the dark. The forest felt endless, surrounded just by the eerie stillness of the dark winter woods. After what felt like hours, I saw a weak, flickering light in the distance. It gave me the strength to quicken my pace. As I got closer, the familiar outline of the cabin came into view. I stumbled toward it, my legs threatening to give out beneath me. My hand pounded on the wooden door. "Hello? Please, I need help." My voice hoarse from the cold and panic. After a moment, the door creaked open and the homeowner appeared. It was the same man I delivered to before, his lined face creased with concern. "What on earth? Come inside, quick," he said, ushering me in. The warmth of the cabin hit me like a wave, and I nearly collapsed onto the worn couch by the fire. I tried to explain everything, my words tumbling out in a frantic rush. There was this man, a plow driver. He tried to grab me. I ran. I didn't know where else to go. The man listened patiently, and without hesitation, he grabbed the phone on the counter and called the police. While we waited, he handed me a blanket and a cup of hot tea. My hands shook so badly that I spilled some, but I didn't care. The warmth helped calm me, but I couldn't stop thinking, what if he came here next? The police arrived about an hour later, their flashing lights breaking the pitch-black night outside the cabin. I ran to the door as they stepped out, feeling a rush of relief at the sight of their uniforms. I recounted everything again, trying to keep calm this time. They listened carefully, taking notes and asking questions. Then one of them said, "Let's get you back to your truck. We'll check it out and make sure you can get out of here safely." The idea of going back out there made my stomach twist, but I knew I had no choice. When we arrived, my truck was exactly where I'd left it, half buried in snow, and still blocked by a wall of plowed snow from where the man had tried to trap me. The officers' flashlights scanned the area as they stepped out. One of them inspected the truck while the other looked around the surrounding woods. "No sign of him," one officer said after a few tense minutes. "But we'll keep an eye out. Let's get you unstuck." I could feel my hands shaking on the steering wheel as the truck finally lurched free. Relief washed over me when the officer gave me a thumbs up, signaling I was good to go. "We'll follow you back to the main road," one of them said, "just to make sure you're safe." That short drive felt like it lasted forever, but having those flashing blue and red lights behind me was a comfort I needed. When we finally reached the highway, they pulled up beside me, one officer rolling down his window. "You'll be okay now," he said. "If anything else happens, don't hesitate to call." My voice caught in my throat as I thanked them. To this day, I don't know who that man was or what he truly intended. But I know I'll never forget the look in his eyes when his friendly facade slipped. I'll never forget the way he blocked my truck, the way he grabbed my arm, and I'll never forget the desperation I felt as I ran through the woods, wondering if I'd ever make it out. Now, every time I drive those remote roads, I carry a flashlight, a portable phone charger, and pepper spray within arm's reach. I know better than to rely on the kindness of strangers, because sometimes the people offering help are the ones you need to fear the most. Photography has been my hobby since I got my first camera when I was 12. It's a lifestyle that combines my love for adventure and solitude. So, when I booked a remote cabin near Bar Harbor, Maine during a winter storm, I wasn't deterred. In fact, the thought of capturing wildlife against a backdrop of fresh snow was exactly the kind of challenge I craved. The cabin was everything I'd hoped for. Small, rustic, and nestled deep in the woods. There was no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and the nearest neighbor was at least a mile away. It was perfect. The caretaker had left a stack of firewood by the front door and a note reminding me to keep the generator running during the storm. The place had a charm to it, with its creaky wooden floors, a stone fireplace, and windows that looked out onto the endless expanse of snow-covered trees. I spent the first day scouting the area and snapping a few preliminary shots. The storm was already starting to roll in, heavy flakes falling from a sky that seemed to press down on the world. By the time night fell, the wind had picked up, howling through the trees like a living thing. I settled into the cabin with a cup of coffee, reviewing the photos I'd taken. The fire crackled in the hearth, and for a moment I felt a profound sense of peace. That's when the sound hit me, the clear, undeniable crunch of footsteps on the snow. I didn't move, focused on the noise. The sound returned, just outside. My first thought was that it could be a deer or maybe a fox, but something about the rhythm was off. It was too human. Grabbing my flashlight, I moved to the window and peered out. The snow was falling heavily and the wind whipped through the trees, but I couldn't see anything. The footsteps ceased and all I could hear was the storm. I told myself it was nothing and went back to my seat, though my nerves were on edge. The wind rattled the windows and I tried to focus on editing my photos, but my attention kept drifting back to the window. An hour passed before I heard the sound again. This time it was louder. It sounded closer, circling the cabin. My chest tightened as I grabbed my flashlight and moved toward the door. Slowly, I unlatched it and stepped onto the porch. The cold hit me immediately, sharp and unforgiving. "Hello?" I called into the darkness, my voice swallowed by the wind. The beam of my flashlight swept across the snow, revealing nothing but the pristine, untouched surface. No footprints, no tracks. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. My mind raced through the possibilities. An animal, the wind, maybe even my imagination. But none of them felt right. The storm was in full force now, the wind howling like a wounded beast. I added more wood to the fire, hoping the flames would chase away the unease creeping over me. Rest was elusive that night, the cabin's groans to the wind's wails fueling my anxiety. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke with a start to the sound of heavy thudding on the roof. I bolted upright, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound came again, deliberate and rhythmic, like someone or something was walking across the roof. I grabbed my flashlight and a fire poker, trying to muster some courage as I moved to the window. The storm had eased a bit, and the moonlight broke through the clouds, spreading a soft glow over the land, but the roof was out of sight, and I couldn't see anything unusual. The thudding ceased suddenly, and a heavy, unsettling silence took over. The next morning, I ventured outside to investigate. The snow was deep, but the storm had left a strange stillness in its wake. That's when I saw the footprints in the snow, leading from the tree line to the cabin and circling it before disappearing back into the woods. They were human, unmistakably so, but barefoot. My insides churned as I followed their path, stopping when I noticed something carved into the snow near the back of the cabin. It was a symbol, unfamiliar and intricate, etched into the frozen ground with precision. I stared at it, a cold dread washing over me. Who had done this, and why? I spent the day inside, haunted by the feeling of being watched. Each time I looked out the window, I thought I'd see someone at the tree line. But the woods remained silent, the snow undisturbed. That night, I heard the footsteps again. This time, the sound was heavier, each step sending a chill through me. They circled the cabin again and again, pausing near the windows as if whoever or whatever was out there was trying to peer inside. I didn't dare move, barely breathing as I listened to the sound of boots crunching in the snow. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped, followed by a loud bang on the door. My heart leapt into my throat as I grabbed the fire poker, gripping it tightly. The banging came again, more insistent. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound imposing. No answer. Just the wind and the sound of my own ragged breathing. The banging stopped, and for a moment I thought it was over. But then I heard the faintest whisper, so soft it could have been the wind, coming from just outside the door. I didn't wait to hear more. I locked myself in the bedroom, pushing a dresser against the door for good measure. The next morning, the footprints were gone, erased by the night's fresh snowfall. But the symbol near the back of the cabin had been redrawn, larger and more detailed than before. I grabbed my stuff and got out of there without looking back, the unease clinging to me like a second skin. The caretaker of the cabin dismissed my story as paranoia brought on by isolation. But I know what I heard, what I saw. Even now, I can't look at photos from that trip without feeling a chill. Some places we seek for solitude have their own rules, their own inhabitants. And sometimes those inhabitants don't want to be disturbed. As a marketing professional, solo work is the default, but switching up my environment now and then keeps me sane. That's why I'd rented a remote cabin near Lake Placid for a week. The idea was to escape the city, focus on a new project, and maybe enjoy the serene beauty of winter. The cabin was perfect. Small, cozy, and tucked into the woods with nothing but snow and trees in every direction. It was exactly what I needed. Nothing significant happened during the first 2 days. The storm had already started rolling in when I arrived, and by the second night the snow was falling steadily. I didn't mind being snowed in. I'd stocked up on groceries, the generator was humming along, and I had a stack of books to read when I needed a break from work. The crackling fireplace and the muffled quiet of the woods were exactly what I'd been craving. By the third evening, the storm had grown fierce. The wind screamed outside, shaking the windows and piling snow high against the cabin walls. I was working on my laptop at the kitchen table when I heard a frantic knocking at the door. A knot formed in my stomach as I stood up, the comforting stillness of the cabin now feeling eerie. "Who's there?" I called. "Please, my car broke down," a man shouted back, his voice muffled by the wind. "I need help." I hesitated, looking at the heavy flashlight on the counter. The storm was brutal, and if his car had truly broken down, he wouldn't last long out there. Still, something about the situation felt off. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the cabin was so remote. I cracked the door open, the icy wind slamming into me as I peered out. The man was hunched against the cold, wearing a thick parka and clutching his arms for warmth. His face was partially hidden by a scarf, but his eyes were wide with desperation. "Please," he said again, his voice trembling. "I just need to warm up." Though it didn't feel right, I stepped back and let him in. Snow blew in with him, dusting the wooden floor before I could slam the door shut. "Thank you," he gasped, pulling off his scarf and hat. His face was gaunt, his skin pale from the cold. He looked harmless enough, but my unease didn't fade. "Where's your car?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "Just down the road," he said, rubbing his hands together. "It slid into a ditch, and I couldn't get it out." I nodded, though his answer didn't explain why he'd been wandering so far off the main road. Still, I offered him a blanket and a cup of coffee. He settled near the fireplace, thawing out as I watched him carefully from the kitchen. Over the next hour, we made awkward small talk. His name was Travis, and he claimed to be on his way to visit family in a nearby town. Something about his story didn't sit right with me, though. He avoided eye contact. His answers were vague, and when I asked about his car, he changed the subject. The storm raged on outside, and I couldn't exactly send him back out into the cold. But the longer he stayed, the more uneasy I felt. I told myself I was overthinking, that the storm and the isolation were messing with my head. Still, I locked the bedroom door when I went to bed that night, the sound of the wind masking every noise inside the old cabin. I didn't sleep well. Every noise felt amplified. The floorboards settling, the wind whistling through the cracks, even the faint rustle of Travis shifting in the living room. At some point, I thought I heard him moving around, but I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Morning came, and the storm had eased, leaving a blanket of fresh snow over everything. I found Travis in the kitchen, sipping coffee like he belonged there. He didn't seem in any hurry to leave, which only heightened my suspicion. "You said your car's just down the road?" I asked. He nodded, his eyes darting to the window. "Yeah, but with all this snow, I'm not sure I'll be able to get it out today." I grabbed my coat and boots. "I'll help you take a look." His face paled, and for a moment, he looked like he might argue. Then he forced a smile and nodded. "Sure, thanks." We trudged through the snow together, the cold biting at my face. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but when we reached the road, my stomach sank. There were no tire tracks, no sign of a car, just an unbroken expanse of snow stretching in both directions. "Are you sure this is the right spot?" I asked. Travis froze for a moment, his eyes darting along the empty road. "Maybe it's farther down," he muttered. But I wasn't buying it. My heart raced as I turned back toward the cabin, my mind racing through every worst-case scenario. Who was this guy? Why was he really here? Back at the cabin, I grabbed my phone and pretended to check for a signal. "I'll call for a tow truck," I said, hoping to gauge his reaction. He stiffened, his smile slipping. "That's not necessary," he said quickly. "I'll figure it out once the snow melts." That was the moment I knew I couldn't trust him. I kept my distance for the rest of the day, my nerves fraying with every passing hour. Travis alternated between trying to make small talk and staring out the window. That night, I locked myself in the bedroom again. Sleep was out of the question. Around midnight, I heard the faint creak of floorboards, followed by the soft click of a door opening. My pulse quickened as I strained to listen. Then came the sound of footsteps moving through the cabin. I held my breath. The footsteps stopped just outside the bedroom door, and for a moment the only sound was the howling wind. And all I could see was the firelight flickering under the crack of the bedroom door. "Travis?" I called, the name barely leaving my throat. No answer, just silence. It was like he was testing the boundaries of my nerves. I crept to the door and pressed my ear against it. For a moment, there was nothing but the wind outside and the crackling of the dying fire. Then a low, guttural whisper came from just beyond the door. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone chilled me to my core. I backed away, my legs trembling. "Leave," I shouted. "I've called the cops. They're on their way." Silence. Minutes stretched into hours, and the sounds never returned. The fire died out, plunging the cabin into darkness. I sat there in the cold, waiting for the first rays of sunlight. When dawn finally broke, I cautiously opened the door. The living room was empty, the air heavy with an eerie stillness. The blanket Travis had used was gone, as was the mug he'd held. Steeling myself, I stepped outside. The storm had passed, leaving a pristine white landscape. There were no car tracks, just a single set of footprints leading away from the front door. I went back inside and lit the fire again, but I couldn't work the rest of the day. I just sat on the couch staring at the fire. I don't really know what happened to Travis. I don't even know if that was his real name. But I know one thing for sure. Even if his intentions were bad, I did what I thought was the right thing. Leaving someone to fend for themselves in a snowstorm wasn't an option. If these winter chills gave you the creeps, don't let them freeze in the shadows. Hit that like button and share with friends who love a good scare. Subscribe and smash the bell so you never miss another spine-tingling tale. Got your own Frosty Fright story? Email me. I'd love to feature it. Stay safe, stay warm, and remember, not everything in the snow is as innocent as it seems. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next nightmare.